So I hope you're all healthy and well. Thank you all for attending this webinar. I'd like to start by setting the scene, giving a few housekeeping points, and then to go on to introduce our two guest speakers. So we have gone through some pretty unprecedented times this past year across the board. And we wanted to discuss how this has affected the cybersecurity industry, and specifically from the viewpoint of the first 24 hours of an incident. Our two experts, are coming from different seats at the same table and will give their views and opinions on a number of topics that we put forward. Before I continue, just if Matt or Mark, can you give me a nod to make sure that you can hear me correctly and audio is working and everything? Brilliant, wonderful.
Yeah, all good, Jacob.
Thank you. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Wonderful. So Mark, would you mind describing just in 10, 20 seconds who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jacob. My name's Mark Tibbs. I'm the Cyber Intelligence Director at MDR Cyber. So MDR Cyber are part of Mishcon de Reya LLP, a traditional law firm. We have a large litigation practice, a family practice, lots of typical sort of parts of a law firm that you might expect to see. But we also have a cybersecurity and digital investigations consultancy. So my role is I lead the digital investigation side of things, get involved in incident response and cyber threat intelligence.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. And then on to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Matt Lawrence. I am the Director of Detection and Response. I'm here at F-Secure. My role kind of spans both our managed detection response service and leading our threat hunting team, and also our incident response capability, the guys and girls who are going out and responding to incidents on the ground all over the world. So through that, we get quite a good insight into what's going on in terms of incident response and the threats that businesses face.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt and Mark. So our first topic is very dependent upon the victim organization. However, Matt, would you mind describing your experiences of what type of incident seems to have had the worst effect across the board over the last six to 12 months?
Yeah, I think you are right to point out that this is very context driven, depending on the maturity and the position of the organization in terms of the type of actors that would target them. I'm sure Mark can cover this point in some depth in a second, but really I think it's plainly obvious at the moment that ransomware is really the key threat and most obvious threat that most businesses are facing down today. I think what we have seen over the last several years is a sea change in the way ransomware occurs. Gone are the days perhaps of the likes of threats that we saw with WannaCry, a more automated form of ransomware deployment. That's not to say that automated ransomware and wormable tooling is not still prevalent, but the biggest impact we're seeing is in a category of attack that we refer to as human operated ransomware. This is where you see these big news stories that hit impacting some fairly large organizations, which talk about perhaps the more sophisticated nature of the attack. What that refers to is the way that these attacks occur from initially starting from a commodity basis, so regularly through phishing, through externally internet facing vulnerabilities as two quick examples. And once the attackers are inside, the human driven element then comes to play, where they actively elevate privileges, move laterally, and ultimately move to deploy their ransomware at the most inopportune moments to cause the greatest impact. And I think many businesses today are continuing to be caught out by this, and we are seeing over time an evolution in the extortion tactics that these threat actors are operating within. And that's not to say as well, if you consider some other recent threats like the SolarWinds case, that ransomware isn't the only prevalent threat today. Latent extortion attempts and also still rife in the face.
Mark, I think Matt's signal has slightly dropped out there. Would you mind just putting your opinion across on this, please?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Matt very much that most businesses, so ransomware is a global problem. It does affect sectors in different ways. We know that industrial services companies are disproportionately affected by ransomware, but it's everyone's problem. So I think you know, when we're talking generally, then ransomware is a huge issue. There are obviously sectoral and geographical differences between the types of threats that you might experience, and also down to the business that you are. But I think the ones that have the biggest impact, the cyber incidents have the biggest impact are where there's either a financial loss, reputational loss, regulatory issues, you know, sort of personal data breaches, and there's been a few over the last few years that I can think of that sort of express that really well. So, for example, British Airways being fined 20 million by the ICO for a personal data loss due to Magecart. And then I think there's also sort of you know, you can make a good situation out of a bad situation in some senses. So while ransomware can be extremely severe, extremely stressful, there are some companies that have dealt really badly with quite severe attacks, but they, you know, because of their not being prepared, or perhaps actually cultural issues that maybe incentivize people to act in unethical or you know, illegal ways, for example. So yeah. So I think you know, a big part of what makes a bad attack is actually to do with the way that the business is prepared already, and the culture of the business. Things like we'll talk about in the next section, but executive buy-in is so important. You know, to deal well with a severe attack, it's critical. So yeah, so what's the worst kind of cyber incident for a business? Certainly ransomware at the moment for most people. You can make it better by preparing yourself.
Definitely, thank you. That's really insightful, and I think it's almost a leading question that I asked, but it's really interesting to hear both your opinions. And I think no matter what type of incident it is, the need for proactive readiness or detection has a really important part to play in successfully stopping an attack. Hopefully before it's actually an attack, but certainly before it's done irrevocable damage. Our first polling question will appear momentarily. If we can just consider this while, hopefully you should see that. I'll give you a few seconds just to consider it and to drop your opinion in there. Hopefully that's come through. There we are. So without a doubt, it's great to see that we all agree that an effective and tested plan or playbook is key to successful response. Mark, with that in mind, what do you think are the most important aspects of the team that's required to deal with an organization, to deal with an incident?
So a nice answer here is it depends, but it depends on the severity and type of the attack, and I know that there's ways that incident response teams classify those in order to choose the element, you know, the level of response that they provide. So there's that. But I mean, really, what you want to do is you want to have playbooks that set out when to call in certain expertise. So there's a myriad of different stakeholders that you would have in any incident response, and it could be, you know, it could be comms, it could be legal, it could be PR, it could be HR, it could be, you know, as well as your technical incident response team, your incident manager. There's a massive number of people, executives, like there's so many different people that could be involved in it. Yes, it is a team sport, but they don't need to be involved in every incident. So you need to set your thresholds to say when you're gonna call in those people to do what and under what circumstances, and everyone to know. So I think, like, that's probably the most important thing. Sort of overlooked quite a lot is probably involving your cyber insurer as well. You know, dusting off your policies, getting your broker and your cyber insurer involved in the planning. is often key. Making sure that you're, if you do have cyber insurance, that that their preferred provider is your preferred provider of incident response services. So yeah, so I mean, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to when you should call in certain teams, but what you should have done is taken away the need to make decisions during the crisis. And I think that's what playbooks are really, really good for, is that they take away that unnecessary friction that you don't want your teams to have and have to think about. They just want to know what to do, when, who to call, and make sure there's a deputy, and there's backups in terms of processes as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And Matt, what are your thoughts on this from your experience building and leading a technical incident response team, and the types of people that you engage with during those key first 12 to 24 hours of an incident?
Sure. So I think Mark's done a great job of outlining the organisational perspective there. From a technical point of view, I think you need to consider, the technical landscape that we live in today, and the whole breadth of technology that businesses utilise in terms of their day-to-day operations. It would be lovely if incidents only happened on Windows endpoints, for example, because it'd be really easy to align and train people for that. But unfortunately, you cannot really predict adequately the scale of an impact of an incident. You can what we do say is compromise is inevitable, but we can't tell you what the timing and severity will be. And from a technology perspective, it really is impossible to have any one team that has the full breadth of knowledge required to respond to every single incident that you may face. Therefore, as Mark outlined, utilising the resources that you have within your organisation, both technical and non-technical, is absolutely essential, and also bringing in external expertise when you need it. There are three key things that are really important in incident response, and that they are, at a high level, speed, visibility, and expertise. In the first 24 hours, you need to get to a point where you have good visibility of what's happening in the incident to enable you and the crisis management team to make decisions. Without that visibility, you will never get to a point of being able to adequately respond, because this is where you fall into the trap of perhaps conducting whack-a-mole response, where you're totally reactive to the attacker's actions rather than thinking more strategically, mitigating the risk, thinking what's best for the business. How do we maintain our operations under this phase? And really, bringing your people together is a great thing, but it must be done proactively. You do not want to be in a position where you're forming your incident response team, your crisis management team, at the point of an incident, because in the middle of a crisis, that's the worst possible moment to try and affect change. And proactivity in this space of bringing your organisation together, activating common sense on your planning phase, preparing your playbooks, making sure you are forensically ready for compromise is crucial in today's threat landscape.
Yeah, and I'd add to that as well, around the sort of threat intelligence side of things, making sure that you've got a team there ready to do the investigation if necessary, and learn from it, even if it's unsuccessful. Get some organizational learning from the attackers, what their intentions are, what their motivations are, what their goals are, what their tactics are, so that you can learn from it and be better next time. So yeah, there's a degree of sort of lessons learned, but also enabling the prioritization of your response. So if you know that, I don't know, a piece of malware is a coin miner, that might change the way that you respond compared to if you thought it was a precursor to a ransomware attack. So so making sure that you have that expertise on hand if it's outsourced or if it's in-house.
So just want to give a quick example, because I think Mark makes a great point with the role of threat intelligence here. Is one quick way that we utilize threat intelligence as part of our incident response team and the service we provide is thinking about ransomware actors. We utilize that threat intelligence to understand where the actors are and for example, what time zone they're operating in. Understanding that can be a game changer in your response, because that enables you to target your remediation plan, for example, at the most inconvenient time for the attacker. And really, all of these things to come together to affect your decision-making process and give you the best possible chance of succeeding in the midst of a crisis.
No, and that feeds into exactly what I was going to say. That the two overriding themes that I'm getting for that are visibility or detection. So being able to pick up an attack as soon as possible, to then inform your response, and having as much of a complete visibility of that is kind of one of the key parts.
Yeah,
and the other aspect is, oh, sorry.
No, sorry, Jake. I was going to say as well around the kind of preparedness aspect of it. We've dealt with several incidents where logs have not been made or turned on, and so ensuring that you've got that visibility to be able to get the information that you need when you need it. Obviously, when you're working with third-party companies, sometimes that's difficult, but ensuring that preparedness amongst your IT security teams is also key, because that's going to be the difference between knowing what went on and not knowing, and being able to make a regulatory report that says we know what happened, we know what the access was, compared to we don't know because we weren't logging, is much more powerful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And again, that feeds into the final point of just being able to run simulations. And generally speaking, when someone says simulation, you think it could be, a really quite extensive exercise, but we do them quite often with fire drills, fire evacuation plans. We put them to the test. We run different scenarios. It should be the same with an incident. And it can be one of those ones that you're trying to catch people out and see where the weaknesses are, but it could also be a very collaborative tabletop exercise just to make sure the right people, you have contact details, for example, for your insurer, a law firm, like whatever it may be, or your technical response team, and knowing who to connect to at the right time. So yeah, that's really, really interesting points there.
And not just your internal teams as well, but also suppliers. Yeah. So that relationship with your suppliers is key as well, and making sure that if you do have an incident response retained firm, that they have delegated authority to speak to your data center provider or whoever it is, that can also reduce friction.
Awesome. Wonderful. Just before we move on to the next slide, I have another polling question, which should appear momentarily, and it will lead us hopefully nicely into the next point again. So I appreciate this question is very subjective, but it'll be quite interesting to see across the board what you all feel. Just give it a few more seconds. Brilliant. We'll just wait for those results to come in now. Interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do we also feel that maybe the global pandemic has possibly created a bit of a ticking time bomb with this as well? So focus has been taken away from security, because obviously with what's gone on, it's definitely been a tough year. But the fact that ransomware is still right up there is it's intriguing. Matt, could you possibly talk about what types of threat come to mind here from your experience? And it would probably help if I moved on to the right slide. But what types of threat come to mind that really, really do create a kind of primary security concern across the board?
Yeah, and I did just drop out there for a second and just caught the tail end of what you're saying, but hopefully I'm going to give you the answer the question you're asking correctly. The cyber threat landscape is continually evolving. We've already touched on ransomware, and I don't want to continue to flog that. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the only threat that that businesses face, but I think just referring back again to the SolarWinds attack recently, you know, there is a certain perspective there where I think, you know, many organisations have had their eyes open to a potential, you know, high severity risk there. But you know, when you consider you know, the supply chain risk, for example, and all of the different you know, pieces of technology and services that businesses utilise, you know, really, and Mark and I were talking earlier this week in preparation for this about how, you know, really the supply chain risk hasn't changed with the advent of the SolarWinds attack. It is the mere fact that, you know, many organisations are waking up to the potential exposure. And you know, just referring back to you know, the previous question there, you know, the way of combating these threats is, you know, preparation is fundamental. And really, I think if you think about how or look into how the SolarWinds breach was initially detected, it was good security hygiene that led to the investigators pulling that thread of suspicion and understanding, you know, that something potentially bad had happened. It was a two-factor authentication prompt. I think it's something that we're all fairly familiar with when you register a new device and you get all of those emails from the service providers to warn you that something has changed in your account, and if this wasn't you, do you want to do something about it? That's a really simple control. You know, it wasn't an AI-driven detection that led to that particular sophisticated breach being discovered. But you know, I think many organisations are waking up to the fact of their risk exposure and their ability to manage it. And if I just kind of translate that into, you know, again, referring to ransomware because it's so prevalent, is you know, one risk that we see, particularly when attackers are inside organisations, is, you know, the way many businesses approach IT administration, for example. When you consider that attackers are looking to elevate privileges and move laterally to the most valuable assets, you know, having uncontrolled IT administration with, you know, shared admin passwords, you're making an all-you-can-eat attacker buffet. You're basically begging for them to pop a domain admin credential, for example, and, you know, start to, once they have a foothold like that, it's an incredibly dangerous place to be. This is where you move from, you know, from having a fairly low severity incident that can be covered off quite quickly to having a broad scale incident where the attacker has a strong foothold, and you have to go down the lines of, you know, taking, you know, really potentially, you know, high severity actions to combat the attacker's access. And that can really impair businesses. And if you're not prepared to do that, if you've not thought coherently of how you can prepare and corner an attacker once they're inside your infrastructure, you know, that is a recipe for disaster in today's threat landscape.
No, absolutely. Mark, do you agree with Matt on that? And what are your kind of recent experiences?
Yeah, I do. I think again, key to defending yourself is having done a bit of preparation around, you know, the threats that you face, in particular your technology and asset sort of profile, your peers in the sector, and then sort of global problems everyone's facing. So understanding and have a really strong response to your senior leadership when they ask you questions that are driven by news and media, which is part of the job, right? So being able to say, we've considered this risk and this is how we deal with it, on supply chain risk, for example. It isn't a new threat. And like Matt says, it's just that the SolarWinds incident has piqued everyone's interest in it, and it's hit the news, and it's an interesting threat. But actually, yeah, the risk hasn't changed. For you know, the majority of cases that we deal with, our sweet spot is financial crime, cyber-enabled fraud in particular. Because we're dealing with large losses where there's usually where there's an element of taking legal action to make recoveries. So in particular, business email compromise, basically large scale transfers, diversions of funds from an email compromise, ransomware cases as well, investment frauds that have cyber enabled elements to them, such as domain typo squatting and those kind of things. So in terms of, you know, what are the and it's difficult to say because it's all based on who you are. But what are the types of threats that we see a lot of, and we know that there's a big concern about? It's ransomware, it's large scale cyber enabled fraud, and I suppose on the positive side, you know, there are things that can be done to mitigate those, both of them. Ransomware is a bit harder at the moment, but certainly cyber enabled fraud, there's some simple things that can be done that businesses you know, can do. And then there's also, and we'll talk about it later, there's also opportunities for financial recovery through legal action.
Absolutely. There's been a question asked, which I think is very pertinent, considering what we've just discussed. The question is that some organizations, regarding ransomware attacks, some organizations pay the ransomware fee, even though there's not necessarily a guarantee of getting data back, but it seems like it's the best step forward to getting back on track. And this was obviously something that we discussed the other day amongst the three of us, that, you know, from a business perspective, we look at this from a cyber perspective, but from a business perspective, the key objective is to get back running again in the kind of the normal MO. But with your two experience, are we seeing that, you know, what's your view of this strategy of paying basically? Do you think it's right? And I guess there's a moral answer and kind of a business organizational answer to that. Mark, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I think it's a difficult one. Basically, I think in some instances, directors of businesses are doing their duty by paying. Yep. They are trying to protect their businesses. They're trying to protect jobs. It could be an existential, almost an existential crisis. It has, but you know, businesses like TravelX last year went into administration, and they blamed the ransomware attack they'd had. So you know, there's a very difficult decision to be made by senior leadership there. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think it's sometimes just the inevitable, you know, the right thing to do in some instances. However, I suppose some businesses take a different view, whether they're just thinking about their duties as a director and their duties to their business and their employees and their customers. They're also taking a look at the wider ramifications. You know, whether it's ethically the right thing to do. Obviously, the more that these groups get paid, the more they're going to be emboldened to try and do it again. So, and I know this week there was some media speculation around the role of insurers, and that's had a response from the insurance business saying, you know, we are not supposed to be this panacea. Silver bullet that just saves you when you have a cyber attack. You're supposed to be doing your bit as well. So and it doesn't replace good risk management. So a really good example of a really you know, so I said the other day, didn't I, making lemonade out of lemons. There was the Norsk Hydro attack. I think it was 2018 or 2019, where they refused to make the payment on the grounds of, we want everyone to learn from this, and we're going to recover ourselves, and it's going to cost us millions of pounds. But they did it, and you know, probably you know that had well, I'm talking about it now, right? So the PR effects of it would have been very positive to take that stance on it as well, rather than hush it up and pay the ransom and move on. So I just think it's not a simple case by case. It's case by case, but I don't think you can broad brush say you're wrong to pay the ransom.
No. Matt, just before we run out of time on this, could you, in 20 seconds, just give your opinion? We can always come back to it in the Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, let's not fall into the trap of victim blaming with regards to paying ransomware. Mark outlined it really well. You can't criticize an organization for wanting to save their business in a difficult moment. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to negotiate with criminals, and it can be incredibly complex, even if the decision is made to pay, because, for example, are you indirectly funding terrorism and causing a criminal act? But I think I'm very sympathetic to organizations and think fundamentally, you know, sometimes it's about protecting jobs, protecting livelihoods, and the people who are, you know, who depend on that organization. And we really have to get out of our cybersecurity ivory tower at times and you know, get into the real world and understand that, you know, these things all come together. and are important facets of responding to incidents like this.
Brilliant, thank you. Just going into another polling question as we progress into our next slide. That should come up momentarily. And this really speaks of, you've been attacked, you've been breached, and some form of asset, whether it be money or data or something, has kind of gone out of the door. What do you consider as the threshold for you, for it making it worthwhile you spending the money to chase after that, whether it be the legal route or not at all, for that matter? In which case, click on the millions. I'll just wait for those results to come up. Wonderful. Okay, so we seem to have a definite sway towards the higher end, so up to or over £100,000. So I think there is definite recognition that obviously it is possible to go after money, but invariably it can be quite a costly exercise to do so, and there is no guarantee that once you've spent that initially that you can get that back. But with that in mind, I think we can all agree that the ideal situation is to minimize the loss, whatever that may be. And I think we've already touched on a lot of those points about detection, about visibility, and about readiness. But Mark, maybe you could lead this discussion, please, from obviously the more cyber fraud related and the legal aspect.
Yeah, sure. So there are opportunities to chase money if you've had losses from cyber-enabled fraud. We do it very regularly with our clients. I think your audience are right to think that it's not going to be cheap always, although actually sometimes it can just be a matter of picking up a phone to a bank and convincing them without any need for legal orders. But sometimes when it does require legal orders, then it's more costly. So in terms of how we operate with because we're situated inside a law firm, we work alongside lots of fraud lawyers who are very well versed in using sort of civil litigation remedies to go after money. So injunctive measures, disclosure orders where you don't know who the wrongdoer is, which is often the case in business email compromise, for example. So you can go after service providers, compel them to give you information, get that information, use that information to put into your intelligence cycle to work out where the money's gone. And freezing orders, which have the impact of stopping money in a bank account and it can be returned. We've had several incidents like this. Usually they are high value, so we're talking about things like art deals or conveyancing deals where there's a high value property involved. But that first 24 is absolutely critical, because of course as soon as the money is into the attacker's hands, whether it's been diverted on that what we call the financial pivot, so when it's gone from a victim into an account that's operated by a criminal, as soon as they've gone into that, then you need to act quickly to get that money back. And if you can do it within 24 hours, you have a very good chance of getting that money back, and you have a very good chance of getting nearly all of it back, sometimes all of it back. And if it goes longer than that, then often it's lost because it's been transferred in various different batches in a multi sort of jurisdictional laundering chain. But yeah, so I mean, we employ not just that kind of go after the data, but also go after the infrastructure as well. So there's elements of disruption that you can employ, you can do if it makes sense for you to do it, as in taking down domains and going after data. There's even been cases where ransomware payments have been made, decryption keys have been given to the victim, and then legal action has been taken against an exchanger to get the money frozen and remitted. So there's some very creative ways in which the legal professionals can look to try and make those recoveries. But yeah, usually it's when you're doing something like that where you're going to court, there are obviously high costs involved, and it needs to be proportionate to the loss.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. And Matt, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think is your opinion more that we should focus on proactive activity, to stop this happening, if at all possible?
Yeah, to the extent possible. We also have to be realistic here. And ultimately, some preparation is better than none. And I'm a big advocate of, every organisation should look at the things that they already have. And look to actively and consistently improve it over time. That's not the whole end of the journey. You need to consider, everything. But all too often we buy these expensive solutions and do not use the best of them to help us to respond. But really, if you think about it, for response to begin, you need some form of detection. And the first 24 hours of any incident is going to largely depend on when the response begins. If it's 300 days after the initial incursion and the horse has already bolted, the first 24 hours is going to be way different than if you detect something immediately and respond actively and can limit the damage immediately. And as an industry, we need to move response as close to the detection as possible, because when we do that, we limit the impact. And I think every business needs to consider, is their detection capability sufficient? And crucially, do they have the confidence and the checks and balances in place to assure them of their ability to detect? And if you can do that and get to a level of confidence, you then know that you will be able to activate your response in a meaningful moment where you can actually materially impact what the attacker is doing and stop them before they reach their end goal. They can get as far along the kill chain as they like, but if we stop them from exfiltrating data, ransomwaring the estate, causing the impact, ultimately we win. And every organisation needs to think coherently about their detection and preparation in their response.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. I think just to slightly extend on that point, so the detection capability and being able to have a response as close to the initial detection as possible is key. One thing that I think we look at this as a very black and white ability or capability, but realistically, detection and response go hand in hand, and the response part is often the difference between a successful ceasing of an attack or basically just alerting an attacker that you're onto them. And I think one of the key parts of response going into 2021 is that capability is not just, we're going to go in there and boot someone off your network. It's a case of, are you able to monitor? Are you able to have a certain amount of remote capability, pulling artifacts, slowing processes, slowing behaviors and so on. So as a response team, you can holistically deal with an attacker, understand exactly where they are, what they've been doing, and systematically boot them off, in effect, before they leave, a backdoor open or whatever it may be. So I think that, certainly from a lot of the incidents that I've dealt with, has been the real change that we've seen in the evolution of detection and response, obviously trying to keep up with attackers. So with some of that in mind, and with 2020, the various attacks, and as I said, the evolution of the TTPs that we've seen, this leads on to the next slide of what will make the biggest difference on how we cope with an incident. So I'm just going to move on now. I appreciate that this statement is quite ballsy, but I think what would be really useful at this point is, Matt and Mark, if you wouldn't mind sharing your top 3 or top 5 kind of takeaways for effectively coping with an incident in the near to immediate future in 2021. That's not to say it is going to happen, but if it does, what are the things that you would say need to happen Mark, if you kick off, and then Matt, if you wouldn't mind finishing
Sure.
up on that.
Well, I think you mentioned it. One of the sort of learning points that we had this year was being able to do everything remotely. So making sure that you have that capability, or your incident responders have that capability, is absolutely crucial now more than ever, because there's limited opportunities to actually go places physically. So that's a single point. But I suppose key takeaways would be planning. Make sure you've done the planning. Make sure you've got the playbooks. Participation, so make sure you've got the participation and buy-in from your senior leadership. Prioritization, you can't do everything. If 2021 means you've got a budget which is lower, you're going to have to make some bold choices about not doing certain things, and in order to do that, you've got to have a good evidence-backed story about why you're not doing it and why it's not important. So understanding your threat model really well is really important, and then practice. So making sure that not only do you have these plans, and they don't sit, if you do have them, they don't just sit there gathering dust. They're taken out, they're tabletop exercised with the right people, and you've got the redundancies in place in case someone can't be contacted because they're on holiday or whatever it might be. So yeah, those are kind of my key takeaways for 2021.
Brilliant, thank you. And Matt, over to you.
Yeah, John, it's kind of something I do occasionally, at least once a year, is look back at the previous year's threat reports and see what people were predicting versus what our experience was, and we can comfortably state that no one in the industry predicted the pandemic, and I think the impact of unintended consequences can be vast. I recently read a blog post which I recommend everyone tries and searches out, from it was one of the IT administrators at Maersk, who was in place when they were breached several years ago, and felt the vast impact of a ransomware attack, and he talked about how security had become a hot potato to a certain extent within the organization. I think this is things like this play out in every business at different times, but ultimately when the breach occurred, that created real problems. The impact they felt wasn't wholly down to the ransomware event; it was how they handled it. And I knowing people in that business, they learned a lot through that process, and would certainly I think cope very differently today. We want to make sure that, though, the businesses don't have to experience a serious breach before they can improve and give themselves an ability to respond. And I think we've touched on the importance of detection, response, and technical aspects. That, I think, is an immutable fact and crucially important here. But what is often overlooked is the culture of an organization, and crucially the leadership. We have seen, even in businesses that are perhaps not as prepared as they should be, with strong leadership, that can make up for a great deal, and can often, as Mark pointed out earlier, a big incident can actually be a real opportunity. Consider FireEye recently, horrifically breached. If you were making predictions, one would assume that a security company being breached to that extent, it would be devastating for their reputation, but they handled it amazingly. They were very open, very proactive, and ultimately that's down to the fact that they were prepared for that and were able to leverage that coherently. And I think everyone needs to think about, in the midst of a crisis, how are they going to collaborate effectively, understanding that sometimes the attackers may well have a strong foothold and perhaps access to your community.
I think Matt may have just dropped off a little bit. I'll give him 2 more seconds. There he is.
Rely on for your day-to-day business. You need to understand how you're going to gain context with regard.
Yep. I'm just going to, I'll come back to Matt when he jumps back on. It looks like, unfortunately, his connection has dropped off. But there he is, back again. But I'm going to move now on to the Q&A, because I think that's probably going to be one of the most useful parts of this. So for the next 10 minutes, before we wrap up properly, I'll endeavour to kind of go through as many of your questions as possible. A lot of those relate to what we've just been discussing. So if you will bear with me just one moment. I'll start from the bottom first, but so here's an apt one. Very, very good question. How would the response to a cyber attack fit in with general business continuity and general management of the business, i.e. trying to keep the business running as per usual? Matt, would you mind if your connection is stable enough, if you just jump on there for that one?
Yeah, I will. The last point I was making in my last statement was control is the important third element there, regaining control of the situation. And I think that certainly relates to business continuity. I think what you must consider is the ability for the business to continue operating. That's where we need to be. We need incident response to be a business as usual process. With good preparation, in most incidents, businesses will be able to continue or should be able to continue without being wholly impaired. But consider, again, when an attacker is inside a network, which is often, where the impact comes from, when they can bounce around your environment and find your crown jewels and impact your business as it is running, your ability to mitigate that risk is fundamental. And to do that gracefully, understand, how can you limit the risk in that mode of operation with, an attacker inside your environment? If you are just assuming that your perimeter detections are sufficient and your internal security will look after itself, you're not going to be able to establish business continuity in the midst of a compromise, because the things that you may have to do could impair the business. For example, the attacker moves to your web-facing infrastructure. You may have no choice but to take out your website, for example, making it plainly obvious that you're going through a fairly serious situation. That's something, for example, that you can prepare for. You can think proactively. Yeah. Can we find ways to architect that such that it is both resistant to compromise, but in the midst of a compromise, we can take actions against the attacker to limit the spread. There are ways of doing that with physical security, with network security, utilizing things like MDR services with response capabilities to limit the spread. There's many ways of doing it, but if you want your business operation to continue in the midst of a compromise, you must understand and have a plan in place for how you're going to mitigate the risk to enable a business to continue performing in the middle of a crisis.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Sorry, thank you, Matt. And there's actually a legal related question, which I'm just finding. So, Mark, how can you ensure that following an incident, the IT report remains protected by legal privilege? And is this something that should or normally happens, do you think?
So I have to admit I'm not a lawyer. Will it be maintained by legal privilege? I probably have to take that one away to determine whether it would or it wouldn't. I suspect it would be an "it depends" answer. If it was, if it was part of the evidence for a legal case, then it would presumably would be. So, but yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I'm not equipped to answer that, unfortunately.
No, that's fine. So it's my fault for just specifically picking you out. It is one of those, like, I think it's whatever's appropriate for the situation. So, for example, looking at things like expert witness, and especially when it comes to a specific crime, when it relates to this, I think there are a number of steps that need to be followed. And it actually plays into another question that has been asked, which is, when do you involve the crisis management team? When do you involve the BCP team? And I think the best answer to this, and hopefully my two colleagues agree, is you need to involve them straight away. So at least giving someone a heads up that something is happening, even if it's suspected. The key here is to make sure that the reaction is appropriate and controlled, and it's not chasing after an attacker. You'll get it. The point of this is that you want to get ahead. Am I right in saying that?
You are, and I think you positioned it well. You don't want to follow the trap of being the people who cried wolf, because that's a great way of really sort of tiring people out over time. Keep making sure that your processes are aligned and you're prepared, and keeping people informed of the actions that have been taken, perhaps in a situation that is emerging, will enable the decision makers to step in at the right time. But that is facilitated by preparation. If you're not prepared, that's where you fall into that mode of you effectively have to bring your CMT together immediately, because quite frankly, you do not know what you're dealing with. Having good preparation in place is about buying you time and being able to enable the decision-making process. And all too often, it may be that you keep people informed, you go a way down your process, and you find that you're able to mitigate the risk without escalating to a full CMT situation. This is when we're talking about response as a business usual activity, but it's crucial to keep people informed and get them involved in the right time, and that's fundamentally down to your level of preparation.
Yeah, I think having those thresholds predetermined as best as possible, and not always is it easy to do that, because sometimes it's not always clear what's actually happened. But enabling and delegating that authority for the team to make those decisions and see clearly when they need to involve these people is really critical. So obviously, personal data breach. If there's been a degree of that, then you're going to want to get your data protection specialists involved as soon as possible. So yeah, and being able to understand what constitutes a personal data breach, and then being able to get the specialists involved for the regulatory action. Brilliant.
We've got about 5 minutes left, roughly. I think time for a couple of more questions in the next 2 minutes. This is a really interesting one. How much should we be led by our cyber insurance company during a breach? It's often apparent that their best interests may not be the same as the organization's, or the victim, should we say. Thoughts?
I'd say, as we've mentioned earlier, cyber insurance is an important and constituent part of your response, but it certainly shouldn't be in the driving seat. You must consider, and obviously every provider and policy is perhaps different depending on your risk exposure and appetite, but often the difficulty with insurance is that it will only cover a portion of your risk, perhaps the direct impact of a compromise. Often the real term impact of an incident can go long beyond that piece, and actually the damages that ensue from not only effectively recovering but then making sure that you are further resistant to compromise will not necessarily be covered by insurance. So for that reason, it's critical that you take ownership of that process and put yourself in the driving seat. If you don't have the expertise in house, you need to make sure that you bring that in.
Yeah, I think again it speaks to that preparedness, readiness kind of question, doesn't it? I think I mentioned at the beginning, you can involve you can have an influence over your insurance policies, and your insurer, you dust it off and have a look at it and make sure that it covers you for the things you need. But also you can say, I want this incident response team to be written into the policy. So it's worth taking that time now to have a look at your policies, make sure it covers what you need it to cover, and make sure it serves your purposes, as best as possible.
It's been really interesting, hopefully for everyone, not just me, but to hear Matt and Mark discuss and talk through some of these topics.